This week, Scarlett Blake was found guilty of some pretty gruesome crimes. He murdered a man in cold blood in Oxford, a complete stranger that he just found on the street a couple of years ago. And prior to murdering this man, he live streamed himself putting a neighbour's cat in a blender. Now, clearly, this is a very disturbed individual. He claims to have multiple personality disorder. He also claims to sometimes identify as a cat, but also because he identifies as a woman for the purposes of in court, essentially. He is treated as a woman. He was given she, her pronouns. And in the media, he's been treated as a woman. And this week, actually, we just found out that the police have recorded his crime as a female committed crime. Andrew, what the hell do you make of this?
Well, the crime statistics are being skewed because of this absurd new religion of gender identity ideology. And this just shows how deeply embedded it has become. When it comes to the press, I find it absolutely exasperating that they continually refer to male criminals as female when they don't have to. And this is a really important point. There are suggestions, there is advice from IPSO, there is advice from Ofcom. There are no stipulations or demands. There's no legal or ethical ramifications. You can call a man when he's a criminal, and that is a choice that you make. Now, a lot of newspaper outlets and media outlets will say, yes, but they have to reflect the language that's used in the court proceedings, or they have to reflect the language that the police use. And while it is true that the police and the judiciary are captured to the extent that they do use those terms, it is perfectly possible to report on it and say, this man committed this crime, and in court he was referred to with female pronouns. That would settle the matter and make it quite straightforward. They choose not to do it. I have a TV show on GB News. I will refer to male criminals as male, even if they consider themselves to be female. I'm not going to play along with their delusion. I don't think that using pronouns for courtesy really applies when it comes to sex offenders and sadists.
Yeah.
So the media just has to stop. It just has to stop lying to the public. It has to just call these men. And the police have to stop misreporting and misrecording these crimes as female crimes. Otherwise, it does skew reality. All of a sudden, we're supposed to believe that there's been an exponential rise of female rapists and female murderers.
Yeah.
It's an absolute nonsense. I've heard people talking on social media this week about how they were genuinely misled when The Guardian published an article about Blake and didn't once mention that Blake was male, to the extent that Louise Tickle, who writes for The Guardian, wrote a letter to Kath Viner, the editor, and said, I'm not going to write for you again until you stop misleading the public.
Yeah.
In December, we had the BBC report on Naomi Cunningham, who is a man who had encouraged another man to commit sexual offences against a 4-year-old. And in the whole article, it didn't once mention the transgender status of this individual, or that this person identified as female. They just said woman, and they just said she, her. So it wasn't even couched in a footnote.
Yeah.
Now, this is misleading the public. And I think it's really unethical for journalists to mislead the public, particularly when they're under no obligation to do so.
Yeah, and it's just for the benefit of some sicko, frankly. I mean, it's interesting that in terms of the crime statistics, which this is now skewing the crime statistics, because women are, so underrepresented, I guess, in the murderer population, a single murderer like Scarlett Blake can boost the number of murders by women by about 5%. There's only been a few hundred female murderers over the past decade or so. So it's really crazy how this is distorting reality. I mean, Stephen, have you kind of come across this in your newsroom at The Telegraph?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. And I have to say, I totally agree with Andrew, by the way. I think newspapers should call a spade, call a man. I think the problem that a lot of newspapers have is that there basically is an editorial policy that says we must use the transgender person's pronouns. So it's not actually necessarily up to individual journalists how they describe someone in their stories and their copy.
Yeah.
This will be edited by others. And I know that that can cause a little bit of frustration among journalists who are told, that's the newspaper's policy and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, on the issue of transgender women, i.e. men, going into prisons, that's another interesting topic, and I've done a bit of reporting on that. I know some people who work in the prison system who I've spoken to about this topic, and they're very concerned that the Ministry of Justice has basically adopted trans activist language and policies in terms of dealing with transgender people in prisons. And I think the whole situation is almost Stalinist. Like everyone has to pretend that someone's mad beliefs. In this case, I mean, as you say, this chap was identifying as a cat. Why has that got?
He
any
meowed at the jury at one point. I mean, that's the level of derangement we're
Why
dealing
should that
with.
have the same? Why shouldn't that have the same weight as calling this person a woman? In my mind, it doesn't.
Yeah.
I should clarify. I mean, I don't blame the journalist, the individual journalist. My criticism is directed squarely at the editors. They're the ones who've established this policy, and they're the ones who can change it. And they're under no obligation not to. There's no excuse, frankly. And I'm glad that I work for an outlet where we don't have these ridiculous demands from on high. But every outlet should change this, I think. When it comes to the police, well, an obvious solution would be to record crimes by biological sex, and then if the criminal happens to believe that they have a gender identity, something that 0.1% of people do, then you could record, just like you could record the criminal's religious belief. This is after all a metaphysical belief, and so you could record it as well, and then everyone's satisfied. And you could do the same in the NHS. You can do the same across the board. I don't see why this isn't implemented. It's not implemented because, as I say, this is now the new state religion, and it has this sway, and it's not a matter of left and right, as we've seen. I mean, the Daily Mail does this as much as the Guardian does this. This is just isn't. It's the sheer power, the sheer weight of this woke movement, what I call critical social justice, and the extent to which it has dominated, and you can't vote it out because it didn't come about by a democratic process, so we can't get rid of it. So I think the onus is on individual news outlets now to take a stand, but also on the police. Well, firstly, we should ditch the College of Policing, who have implemented so much of this nonsense.
Yeah.
But
then the government has to take a stand against it. Why aren't they doing anything?
Do you think the government makes a bit of noise about something, but is the sort of blob, I guess, if for want of a better word, too powerful? Do they just get in the government's way? Do they, or is the government not that bothered? Is it just making noises?
The thing is, I tend to agree with both sides on this argument that the blob, as it were, does have a huge influence, and there are activist civil servants who are pushing this stuff within Whitehall and so on, and of course that's true. However, at the same time, ultimately, ministers could stop all of this stuff if they had the willpower and if they had the competency to do so. I just don't want to let them off the hook in any way for allowing this stuff to have flourished over the last 10, 15 years. And also, just very briefly on Andrew's point about editors, I think that newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Telegraph have done some excellent reporting on transgender issues, and particularly in our comment pages. We've got some great writers who've, really exposed a lot of the stuff that's going on. So I think there's legitimate criticisms against all newspapers in terms of how they label transgender people, and I think editors should really consider that policy very carefully. As you say, there's perhaps, I don't know the exact IPSO laws and so on, but I'm sure you're right that there's no ethical or legal reasons that they can't name these people as men or women. But at the same time, I think that newspapers have done a fantastic job in exposing so much, including the Telegraph, of exposing so much of what's going on inside the blob and inside all of these stories.
Yeah, I think they got there eventually. I think they dropped the ball for an awful long time. I mean, when it comes to IPSO very cleverly frames it as a question. They say, "Have you used the preferred pronouns of the individual you're reporting on?" But they also say quite clearly that the reporter's job is to not mislead the public. That is very clearly stated, and that is being violated at the moment in the current practice.